I'm Father Pullman.
And I'm Father Schumacher. And
we are the Associates.
Welcome back to a new episode of Ask the Associates.
Yes, today's question is there a difference in the meaning of social justice in the Bible as to what is touted today? How does equal justice fit in?
Good. So social justice is a concept of kind of justice in group rather than just justice from individual to individual. And it's a concept, I would say, that isn't really in the Bible, at least not explicitly, although the origins of our kind of modern conception of it are certainly very strong. The Israelites had a very strong understanding of their requirement by God to do justice for people who were especially likely to suffer injustice. So a characteristic passage is Exodus 22:21, and the following verses. You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not afflict any widow or orphan. If you do afflict them, they will cry out to me, and I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. So the Israelites, and that's just one passage of many in the Old Testament, that taught the Israelites that God intended them to do justice for especially people who were likely to suffer injustice. But it didn't have kind of like a worked out doctrine of social justice that we would call it today. That begins actually with Leo the 13th and his encyclical called Rerum Novarum, or On the New Things. And it's basically, he's responding to the fact that by the late 1800s, society has radically changed with the introduction of kind of modern industrial technology and new forms of government, representative democracy becoming more widespread in the West. And so he's kind of responding to the fact that now we've got kind of broad swaths of people who are at much greater risk of being taken advantage of in a modern industrial economy. So he's kind of trying to work out, well, what does the Catholic Church have to say about that? Are there moral principles that should be applied here? So it's a wonderful document, foundational. And one thing, I'd encourage anyone to read it. It's certainly accessible. One thing that will strike you when you read Rerum Novarum is you're going to go into it with your own political conceptions, and parts of it will make you mad because he seems to be on the other side of the political spectrum, and then other parts of it will make you cheer because he seems to be on your side of the political spectrum. And the point is that he's actually not on any side of the political spectrum, but he's actually speaking as a Catholic to the political environment. So the idea is basically that social justice is the justice that applies not just between individuals, but within a society as a whole. And there are principles for that. They're worked out, beginning with Leo the 13th, Rerum Novarum. There are other documents, Quadragesimo Anno of Pius XI, 40 years later, and then 100 years later, John Paul II wrote a document called Centesimus Annus. So these principles have been continually worked out by theologians and popes since then. What are the principles, Father?
Actually, if I may, perhaps before we get to the principles, which are very important, it occurs to me that we might have someone in the audience who's thinking, so these were made up recently? And the answer is no, but with every new challenge at every age, such as the various heresies that would challenge a truth of the faith, it would force the church to refine and clarify the teaching. And so a case in point, as things, the various forms of government that began to replace the Catholic monarchy of the West, you had certain new economic situations. It used to be, whether it was a king or a lord of the realm, if someone worked for him, they could live on his land, and there were certain things provided, certain protection from invaders, where now the economic model is, if I'm an employee, I get paid, but then I have to find my own housing, I have to find my own protection, I have to find all of these things more or less independent of my employer. And so Pope Leo XIII would be reminding those who were giving a livelihood to others, that actually as a part of a just wage, their condition and their needs were actually kept in mind. So that was just a little bit of the change in social conditions that were happening across the world. So how do you balance things in this new world? Well, there were two principles that Pope Leo XIII brought forth. One was a principle of unity, and so what Father was referring to that would make a Capitalist think wrong. We would often hear this principle of solidarity as him being sympathetic to perhaps communists or socialists or someone in love with a big swollen government. But the principle itself of solidarity is something actually very basic. It's the fact that we all live in the same world, and that in a society, we actually need to realize that we're a part of that society and we function within it. And because of that, there are certain things that we need to keep in mind for the good of society. Now, this was taken in never apart from this other principle, which other people outside of the Catholic faith, and this might actually include some Catholics, would pit this other principle sometimes, the principle of subsidiarity, against solidarity. We might think of it as a hyper-individualism, for example. So the false dichotomy is tyrannical, swollen government versus leave me alone, I have my rights, but I don't necessarily have duties to those of the greater whole. Well, principle of subsidiarity is a balance with solidarity. And the balance is whatever can be done on the more local level should be. So, if I can take care of my family, then I shouldn't leave it to the government to take care of them. If I as a mayor of a town can provide an infrastructure for certain things, fiber optics, sewage, these things, I shouldn't leave it to the federal government to take care of. And this is the question would always be, can we take care of it? And so if you have these healthy units that are also in solidarity with the larger whole, then you have a just society. If you don't have that, these other disorders creep in, where the larger whole may be trying to take the powers and rights that belong to the local area, and the more local area may not care about the good of the rest of society.
Yeah, so as Father has pointed out, that there's these two principles that kind of help to clarify and establish each other. The principle of solidarity and the principle of subsidiarity. Solidarity points out that the common good, meaning the good of the whole of the society itself, and of all of the members together of the society, is a real good, and we have an obligation, in fact, to pursue it. Subsidiarity recognizes that the individual good is a sovereign good, and it can't be trampled upon in pursuit of that common good. And so, as Father points out, the exaltation of the one or the other to the detriment of the other actually destroys the real pursuit of social justice. The two have to go together. They can't be separated. Now, how you work that out is a difficult proposition. That's what the work of politics is for. And it takes, in fact, this is a good point to really encourage Catholics who are involved in the political sphere or in the public life in general, kind of in ancillary work too. Say you're professor at a college or teacher in a school, or you work for some agency, or you assist in some way in the public life of the society. You have a real role to play to help instantiate these authentic principles of Catholic teaching in the work of the society, because although we were taught these things by God, they are true just generally. We're not imposing our religion upon people. We're helping people to realize what the truth of the world really is. That the individual ought to be respected. And the individual, and all individuals collectively, ought to work for the good of the whole and not just for themselves. Now, how does equal justice fit into this? That's kind of the last part of the question. That might be kind of understood as a legal justice, right? We ought to perhaps make sure that people who might find themselves in disadvantaged circumstances actually do have a real chance of success in the society, right? Again, politics might say there are different ways of attempting to accomplish that, and that's a difficult proposition. But that's equal justice would be the legal system itself, the code of laws and the institutions of the society, helping to make sure that there's an equal opportunity for participation in that society.
If I may, some of the encyclicals that you've alluded to before actually make some concrete claims about particular forms of government as well. Pope John Paul II wrote Centesimus Annus, and in it he mentions that communism is fundamentally atheistic and therefore fundamentally against the faith.
And therefore also against the common good.
Exactly, and I'm going to get to why in a moment. Interestingly enough, so he also says a form of capitalism is also not compatible with the faith. Not all forms of capitalism, but this particular instance. If by capitalism you mean that money is your greatest good, love of mammon is the root of all evil, and you cannot serve two masters. As you had mentioned, Father, the common good. It's very interesting because this is why the principle of subsidiarity is so important. The common good is going to look different for these different communities because they're going to have different needs. But one of the things that will always be true of the common good across the board is that it is made up of the good of each person. So the common good will never be Mao Zedong's, you have to crack a few eggs to make an omelet. You don't starve millions of people. It may be on an individual basis to make up what you think is the greater good, but that will always be false. And so St. Paul gives us that line, which I find myself hearkening back to almost every time this subject comes up. Love your neighbor as yourself.
And you will have fulfilled the law.
Click the logo right there to subscribe.
Thanks for watching. New episodes come out every Wednesday.